Hey everyone, this is Jessica and Noam here for an episode of Drums Through the Decades, where we look at how drum sounds have changed and evolved over the last 70 years. Today we are looking at one of the most transformative and influential decades, the 1960s.
From the beginning of the 60s to the dawn of the 70s, recorded music went through this extraordinary transformation. All of a sudden, track counts went higher, fidelity went higher, you went from monophonic sound to stereophonic sound. And through that, artists were able to do things like overdubbing, which completely blew wide open the possibilities of what music could sound like.
Over the course of the decade, some of the most beloved, revered, and influential drum parts of the past century would be recorded. But today we're just going to be looking at four of those, being the Ronettes' Be My Baby, the Supremes' Baby Love, the Jimi Hendrix Experience's Hey Joe, and Strawberry Fields Forever by the Beatles.
It's hard to overstate how dramatically music changed from 1960 to 1970. Much of these changes were driven by the technological changes at the time. Tape machines went from 3 tracks to 4 tracks to 8 tracks to 16 tracks even by the end of the decade. Monophonic sound went to stereophonic sound. Through all these changes, artists were all of a sudden able to manipulate, affect, overdub all of these performances in ways that would never have been possible before.
Before the 1960s, recording was usually used to produce the sound of a live performance. But with new technology, the studio became an instrument in and of itself, which leads us to our first tune, Be My Baby.
It was recorded in 1963 at Gold Star Studios, and it was one of the prime examples of Phil Spector's wall of sound. The room was only 19 by 24 with 13-foot ceilings, but once all the processing went on and all of the things went to tape, it sounded completely massive. The recordings also utilized some of the best musicians that LA had to offer, known as the Wrecking Crew.
The iconic drumming on this track was played by legendary studio musician Hal Blaine, who claims to have recorded on over 35,000 sessions, 150 top 10 hits, and 40 number ones. Today, for our drum kit, we'll be using a beautifully restored 1967 Ludwig Super Classic in blue sparkle, lent to us by our good friend Adam Hansen. The sizes are 14 by 22, 9 by 13, and 16 by 16. And for the snare, we'll be using a Ludwig Acrolite. This kit was built a few years later, but is more or less the same as the kit that Hal Blaine would have been using at the time.
For the Ronettes' Be My Baby, so much of the sound is not from the actual drum mics themselves, but from the other mics that they were using to record the other instruments. The Phil Spector wall of sound, it was like 20 musicians in a tiny room, and they are not necessarily close miking things, right? So every single mic is picking up a ton of the other instruments, and a huge amount of that is going to be drums because drums are going to be the loudest instrument in that room. So even though they have direct drum mics, a bunch of the low end is going to come from the bass mic, a bunch of the mid-range is going to come from whatever instruments they're using to push mid-range on the track, horns, things like that. And there's no separation. You're kind of making choices with all of the consequences of what it does to the drums and what the drums do to it all together. So looking at the individual mics, we had just a really simple setup on this. A kick drum mic, which was an RCA 77, and an overhead mic, which was an Electro Voice 674. The RCA 77 is a ribbon microphone, it's super warm. It also cannot handle a lot of SPL, so you physically cannot put it very close to the kick drum. It has to be at least maybe 4 or 5 feet away. So it's technically a kick drum mic, but it's really picking up the entire kit with an emphasis on the kick drum. Our overhead is this Electro Voice mic, which is a dynamic mic. And using a dynamic as your overhead, you're gonna get a lot less of the crystal clear fidelity that you might get from, say, a condenser or something like that. You're gonna get a little bit more stylized of a sound. You're also gonna get a substantially more directional sound, which is part of why they were using it. If you have a loud instrument nearby, it's not gonna pick up nearly as much of that instrument. So for today, obviously we weren't recording other instrumentalists, but we set up extra mics that are kind of our extra instrumentalist mics that really, they ended up being just room mics, but we set them up in the fashion that we would have if we were recording other musicians in the same room. We had on one side of the room an AEA 44, right, which is basically a recreation of an RCA 44. And then on the other side, we had a vintage RCA 77. These are both beautiful, big sounding tube microphones, and we set them up with the null points facing the drums, meaning that we were trying to get as little drums in them as possible to pick up, quote unquote, the other musicians. What ended up actually happening is, even though obviously we are still picking up plenty of drums because that's all that's happening in the room, we were not picking up any of the direct sound of the drums, right? All of the sound that we would pick up, because the null point was facing the drums that were coming directly at the microphone, all of the sound would be the drums banging around in the room and hitting walls and then hitting the microphone. So we end up with a very indirect, roomy sound that added so much to the low end of this drum sound. We ran all of these microphones through a set of tube pre's. We had our Telefunken tube pre's. And we were doing really minimal EQ. We didn't EQ anything individually on the mics, we just EQ'd the whole drum kit together. We used Pultec EQs, right? We had a little bit of mid-range getting pushed, we had a little bit of the high mids getting pulled away. We were using some of the cutting on a Pultec EQP1A, which allows you to cut just above the low end, right? So it kind of clears out some of the muddiness that you sometimes get with drums. And I was also cutting a little bit of the super high end just to make it so that it wasn't too brittle in the high end. So much of what makes these drums sound the way that they are is because of technical and physical limitations of the time. Tape machines were really noisy at the time. Because of that, you had to push into a tape machine really heavily to get a reasonable signal to noise ratio. The result is you get this kind of blown out sound. You get a lot of saturation, you get a lot of dynamic control. So the dynamics are pretty even though we're using no compression on this, there's pretty even dynamics just because of the amount of saturation that we're using. So one of the most important elements of this entire sound is the chamber, obviously. The chamber is super loud in this recording, it is really pronounced, and it is almost half of the drum sound that you hear is just the chamber. It's part of what made this so challenging for us to recreate, because every chamber is just a speaker inside of a room and a microphone to pick it up. Every room is vastly different. There can be huge differences in terms of the material, in terms of the sizes, in terms of the other things that are in the room for diffusion. All that stuff contributes and it makes the room sound dramatically different. So each studio had their chamber that was unique to that studio and oftentimes is what made those recordings really special. The chamber at Gold Star was this really special chamber that was a huge part of the sound. Unfortunately, that studio got torn down, so that chamber, not only does it not exist anymore, we also don't have any recreations of that chamber because they can't do an impulse response in it because it doesn't exist. So today we used the UAD Capital chambers. They're not exactly the same. If you're hearing differences, that's one of the things that's contributing to it, but it did a good approximation of what it would sound like. The last thing that was contributing hugely to this sound was the way that they were utilizing the tape machines. At the time that this was recorded, they were on 3-track tape machines, right? Meaning that they could not have recorded many instruments separately to begin with. So they had one track that was the entire band, everyone together, including the percussion, everything was recorded live. Then they had a second track, which was overdubs, that was the string tracks and the clap tracks. You'll notice the claps feel kind of separate from the rest of the band. That's because they were an overdub. And then the second overdub was the vocals, which they did after they recorded the band. Because of this, there is a certain saturation and a certain cohesion that happened from every instrument in that record really hitting tape together, and everything affecting each other and everything saturating together. And the result is this really specific sound that is super Phil Spector, super wall of sound. All the percussion that we recorded today, we are saturating together on a bus with the drums so that it feels like they all got recorded onto one track of tape at the same time.
Around the same time that the Wall of Sound was being created in Los Angeles, a Detroit record label called Motown was turning out hit after hit. Using the high-efficiency assembly lines of the Detroit automakers as inspiration, Motown streamlined a hit-making machine. Much like Phil Spector, Motown used a tight group of session musicians called the Funk Brothers as their backing band.
Recorded in Hitsville, USA, which was basically a recording studio built out in a garage in Detroit. Baby Love was recorded in 1964 and was a huge hit. This was in no small part due to the incredible rhythm section, which was James Jamerson on bass and Pistol Allen on drums.
Front and center on Baby Love is Pistol Allen's swinging, driving drum part with heavy hi-hat, strong kick, and stomps driving the beat. The drummers at Motown used several different kits at the time of this recording. We used a Ludwig Vista-like kick drum, a Chad Smith signature Pearl snare, and Zildjian K-Dark hi-hats.
What has changed from the Ronettes to the Supremes? The biggest things are some of the choices that they're making. They have started adding microphones. Not much, but they've started adding a few microphones, and they've also started getting higher fidelity with the microphone choices that they're using. So whereas the Ronettes were using a dynamic overhead, we've started using condensers as our overhead. We added a snare drum mic, which we didn't have in any of the earlier recordings, but all of a sudden we're getting a little bit extra punch, a little bit extra impact by miking the snare close up. The kick drum we're still miking from far away, but we're EQing some extra emphasis in to get that kick drum a little bit more heavy and letting it be the backbone of the song a little bit more than it was in the recordings of the earlier 60s. Also, the way that they were starting to treat the drums themselves started to change. Whereas in the earlier 60s stuff, they would still do a lot of closed front heads, which had these longer kick drum sounds, much more jazz-oriented, much more open. For Motown, they started taking the front head off of the kick drums. So the kick drums got shorter, they got punchier. And for the snares, they started putting tape on the bottom sides of the snares and putting wallets on the top of the snares and just getting everything tighter, punchier. For the kick drum on this recording, we used an RCA 77, same as the other recording. We still had it about 4 or 5 feet away, so it's still picking up the whole kit. We had a snare drum microphone now, so all of a sudden we have this direct snare drum sound. Even though we're sticking it right on the snare drum. We're not sticking it on the top or the bottom, we're sticking it on the side. This was a technique that they were using a bunch in Motown. It's kind of capturing all of the high end and all of the low end at the same time. It's not the beefiest snare drum sound, but they weren't really looking for beef on their snare drums. They were just looking for extra impact, and by miking the shell on the side, it was giving them that. On the overhead, we're using a Mic Shop MS-47, which is basically a Neumann U-47. This is maybe typical of what they used at the time. I think they used 67s more often, but just using a large diaphragm tube microphone as your overhead was allowing you to get so much more detail and so much more depth and so much more low-end extension. Another huge leap forward in this recording was all of a sudden we have 8-track tape. I believe they got the 8-track the year that this recording came out, and this was one of the earliest ones that they were doing to 8-track. Switching to 8-track meant a lot of things. The tape machine all of a sudden had the ability to record many instruments not together. So previously you might have recorded the 2 drum sets on the same track. Now you would record the 2 drum sets to separate tracks. Previously you might have done the keys and the horns on the same track. Now you can do them onto separate tracks. So all of a sudden we're getting this clarity that you never got in previous recordings. We're also starting to record at faster speeds on the tape machine. So all of a sudden, the high end gets extended a little bit further than it normally would have, because we're literally letting the tape rotate more times per minute than we used to, and it's capturing more frequencies. You'll notice the saturation is the same, if not heavier, than it was in the Ronettes. That is not because of any technical issue. That's not because of noise to signal ratios. That is because of a stylistic choice that they wanted this stuff to feel heavier, more impactful, and the way to do that was to push these drums into the tape really hard and get all of this beautiful tape saturation and also all of this leveling of the dynamics of the track. The kick and the snare are pretty much hitting at similar volumes throughout. Part of that is because of the control of the drummers, but a lot of that is because this saturation sets a ceiling where when you hit harder, it just gets more saturated and you don't have to deal with all these crazy dynamics that you might have if you had recorded at a lower volume on the tape machine. So the last elements of this sound was obviously the Motown reverb. That's a very famous sounding reverb. It was the attic of Hitsville, and they would pipe up a speaker up to there and record it with microphones. Like every chamber, this is a very specific sounding chamber. Thankfully, UAD has a version of it that we were using on this, and it sounds really, really accurate. The reverb is less of a sound on this than it is in the Ronettes. You will hear a lot less reverb. Even though it's still a part of the sound, it's not nearly as loud as in that Ronettes recording. The one last thing that contributed to the sound here was the way that they cut this stuff to vinyl. The medium that this stuff was getting recorded to was vinyl, right? That was the way that it was gonna get heard. And the medium was kind of limiting in what they could do. So around this time, they were starting to come up with techniques to how to maximize that medium. One of which was recording at half speed. So what they would do is they would take the tape, they would slow it down to half the speed of its normal rate that it was recorded at, and they would take the vinyl cutter and slow that down to half speed of what it was normally recording at. So you're recording this tape at half speed onto this vinyl cutter at half speed. The result is once you turned up everything to full speed, all of the frequency limitations would jump up by an octave. So if things were starting to taper off around 10K, which was often happening with previous vinyl recordings, once you recorded at half speed, that taper off point bumped up to 20K, and all of a sudden you have all this high end that you didn't previously have. That contributed to all of these recordings suddenly feeling much more hi-fi than they used to.
By the mid-1960s, rock and roll had evolved considerably from the blues and country-influenced artists of the 1950s. Psychedelic rock, which was inspired by hallucinatory drugs that were popular at the time, hit the scene and quickly spurred artists and engineers into new territory.
The Jimi Hendrix Experience was one of these artists. They recorded their first album in 1966 at Delane Lea and Olympic Studios, and Hey Joe was their first single.
Mitch Mitchell was the drummer on this track, and his combination of rock and jazz drumming was legendary. His really fast fills and strong sense of rhythm made him one of the most influential and legendary drummers of the 1960s. While he played various kits in this era, including a Premier and a Gretsch, he also played a Sparkle Ludwig, and so we'll be using the same Ludwig Super Classic as earlier. For our snare, we used a Mapex Black Panther, and for our ride cymbal, we have a 21-inch Zildjian K-Sweet ride.
So for Hey Joe, shockingly, they were still recording onto a 4-track, right? This was done in England. For whatever reason, over there at the time, 4-track was kind of the norm still. And so they were recording with less tracks than Motown was, but somehow it still felt more modern. There's a few things that are contributing to that modern sound. There is the mic choices that they were making. This was recorded with 3 microphones, but they were using some fuller, just increasingly fuller sounding microphones and increasingly more hi-fi sounding microphones. So whereas our overhead was a 47 on the last track, now our overhead is a C12. That immediately starts to extend a little bit higher. It starts to feel a little bit shinier. It starts to feel a little bit more modern in terms of the cymbal sound, in terms of the snare sound. On the kick drum, whereas before we were using an RCA 77, now we are using a Neumann 47. Again, just extending further. This is a huge microphone. So our kick drum is starting to sound massive just on the microphone alone without any of the EQ that we're doing to it. That's starting to change the aesthetics of this sound. The last is the snare drum microphone placement. On this snare drum, we are using a KM84, which is the same mic that we used for the Motown one, except on this, rather than sticking it on the side of the snare, we're sticking it on the top of the snare and we're kind of looking across the snare. So all of a sudden, we've captured this low end and this impact, right? This kind of beefiness and this snap. And that together is a super modern sound, which is immediately elevating the drum sound. We are no longer just capturing the snare drum microphone as like this little extra thing that we're gonna pepper in just if we, this is now an integral part of the snare drum sound, and it's some of the first real close miking that we've experienced thus far that feels very modern. Even though they're on 4 tracks on this song, the tape machines are still getting more modern, right? The tape machines are not the tape machines from the 1950s. They are 4 tracks, but they are starting to get higher end electronics. They're starting to figure out ways to make these machines quieter. And the result of quieter machines is that you don't have to saturate them quite as hard, right? Because you have that signal to noise ratio that you have to worry about a little bit less, you can record quieter into the machine and turn up the faders a little louder rather than having to crank everything into the machine on the preamps and then turn the faders down. The result is dynamics. Not only macro dynamics, which is like the sound of the drums being louder in one section and the sound of the drums being softer in another section, but we have all of these micro dynamics that we are now feeling for the first time. The moment of impact when a snare drum hits, we're gonna get this huge burst of energy that then dissipates. That burst used to be completely eaten up by tape saturation. It used to just feel like a burst of distortion. Now it is an actual burst of our speakers moving air. And the result is a snappiness and an impact to these drums that you were not hearing in any of the stuff from the earlier part of the decade, and you will continue to hear until now, right? We are still using those kinds of dynamics today.
It's difficult to discuss popular music in the 1960s without discussing the group that defined it, the Beatles. Not only were they far and away the most popular group, but by the mid to late 1960s, they had expanded their sound into new and very exciting territory.
After years of nonstop touring, the Beatles retired from the stage in 1966 and committed themselves to recording. Through this time, they made some of the most experimental, interesting, and influential music that they'd ever made. Their studio work was completely legendary. They used all kinds of innovative techniques and tricks to push the boundaries of what recorded music could sound like. One perfect example of this was Strawberry Fields, which was recorded at Abbey Road in the winter of 1966.
Ringo Starr is, of course, the main drummer on this track, with the exception of some overdubs by Paul McCartney and George Harrison. The kit that Ringo is likely playing in this recording was his Ludwig downbeat Oyster Black Pearl kit. Unfortunately, we were unable to get this exact drum set, but we did get a super classic, which is from the same era and has the same sizes. So for the snare, Ringo famously used a Ludwig Jazz Festival, and today we have a matching Blue Sparkle Jazz Festival snare in a similar size. And for our crash, we used a Zildjian 20-inch K-Dark cymbal.
So, talking about the Beatles, this is a big one. There is an unlimited amount of stuff to talk about. There's also unlimited resources on this subject as far as information on how they did this stuff. There's so many innovative techniques that were going on here that we're still using today. To start, the amount of microphones has doubled all of a sudden. Whereas before we were using, 2 microphones, maybe 3 microphones to record the drum kit. All of a sudden we are using 6 microphones on this kit. We have a kick drum mic, we have a tom mic on each tom, we have a snare bottom mic, not a snare top mic, but we're using a mic on the snare bottom. We have a hi-hat mic and we have an overhead. So we're still doing mono drums, but we are recording them with a lot more control than we used to. We are also starting to record every single instrument close up. Whereas in the Hendrix thing, we were starting to put, creep mics in a little bit closer, but we still were using either ribbons or condensers on everything, so we didn't really have any ability to get them that close. All of a sudden, we're using dynamic microphones on all of the drums, and that is allowing us to bring every single mic closer. In the case of the kick, it's super, super close. It's like right up against the kick drum, and that is all of a sudden giving us proximity effect. It's giving us all this impact that we never used to have in the kick drum. It's giving us a crazy amount of low end that we never used to have in the kick drum. So on the kick drum today, we used an AKG D12. This is a vintage mic from around that time. I believe that Beatles were using a AKG D20, which to my understanding is a very, very similar sounding microphone than the D12. On our snare drum, again, this is on the bottom, but we used a KM84. I believe they were using some kind of Neumann microphone that was similar in tonality to a KM84. On the toms, the hi-hat, and the overhead, we were using Warm Audio WA19s. These are meant to be reminiscent of the AKG D19 of the time, which is a very hard mic to get and also a very expensive and fragile mic. So we went with these today, and they are dynamic microphones that are super vibey, and they're also super affordable and are just, kind of vibier than a 57. So there's all kinds of EQ innovations that they were doing at Abbey Road at the time. There is a ton of EQs that we use today. The Chandler Curve Bender, for one, is from that time, and this is a custom unit that they were making just for those studios. They were also using these boxes called RS-127s. These are little standalone EQ units that would either boost or cut 2.7K, 3.5K, or 10K. And it was apparently super common for them to be cranking 10 decibels at 10K on all of the drums, right? This is a really dramatic EQ, and they were using it all over these Beatle records. In addition to that, the console, which was a red console, had very specific EQs that they were using to shape the sound. Up until this point, compression was not really getting used stylistically in a lot of ways. Compression was viewed largely as a way to control signals, right? It was a way to keep the signals from blowing up the tape machines too hard, and it was a way to drive more signal into the tape machine. But it was not looked at as a musical choice in the way that the Beatles looked at it. All of a sudden, the Beatles started compressing their drums like crazy. And immediately you feel this larger-than-life sound from them, and everything feels stylized, and everything feels like it's telling a story, and that it's not just capturing sound in a room. Most of the time, they were using similar compressors on certain instruments. The Fairchild 660 was on tons of the drum recordings at the time. That is a wildly expensive compressor with like 1 million tubes in it. And it has pretty minimal controls. It doesn't have any attack time controls. You have a release time control, but it has a very specific sound, and as soon as you run a drum kit through it, and this is the whole drum kit going through it, you get this attack that feels like the Beatles, right? It's very familiar, the attack of that stuff, and it's all of these microphones going through together into this compressor before they hit the tape machine. There was also a substantial amount of compression on the mix bus, right? Much more than many other artists at the time. They had a specific compressor that they were using most often for this, called an RS-124. This is a really bizarre compressor in that it's hyper slow. And so the attack time is really, really slow. The release time is really, really slow. You have some control over the release time, but even the fastest release time is quite slow. And so the result is you have this compressor that is just constantly compressing, right? Most compressors, they hit a peak in a song, and the kick drum might hit loud and they might get a peak, and then they go back to zero. This compressor, you see the needle just kind of hover around 3 or 5 or 10 or 15 sometimes, and it doesn't feel like it's compressing that crazy because it's not pumping in the way that like a more modern compressor would pump. It's just kind of keeping it very subtly and very gently compressed. Even though it's quite compressed, it's keeping it at that level of compression the whole time, and so you don't even feel it that much. It just feels like everything is kind of coming forward in the mix. So the Beatles, even though they were the biggest band in the world at the time, they were still on 4-tracks, shockingly, at this era. Very famously, the way that they would do it is they would record the rhythm section of the band or whatever the basics were on the track, and they would record them onto 4 tracks, and then they would record all 4 of those tracks onto one track of another machine. And so now they've created 3 tracks open on this new machine that they could record new instruments on, and then they would rinse and repeat that process, and all of a sudden they're recording sessions with tons and tons of overdubs, even though they have this very limited track count. Now, there is a few things that happen because of that. One, it means they're mixing everything as they go. So not only are they mixing, getting all these 6 drum mics together and mixing the drum sound onto one track and baking it in, they're gonna take the drums that they recorded onto the first track, they're gonna add maybe bass, they're gonna add percussion, they're gonna add whatever their next steps are, and then they are gonna bounce all of that stuff down, print it onto a single track of the next tape machine. And the result is all of those things get saturated together, right, in the way that maybe the Ronettes would have done, right? There's a glue that gets put on these tracks as they get mixed down together. There is also compression. They would put that RS-124 compressor not only on the mix bus as a whole, but also on each time they would bounce things down, they would put that compressor on. So what you end up with is these layers of compression that are almost the way that we would do it in modern recordings, right? Modern mixing, you might subgroup the drums and the percussion and the bass together and put those into an aux track and compress all of those, and then put all the guitars together and compress all of those, and so on and so forth, and get this kind of funneling effect of all these layers of compression funneling into your final mix bus compressor. The Beatles invented it, essentially, right? They were doing this as somewhat a necessity years and years before anyone else was. So you can hear in this drum recording that not only is there drums, but there's also a maraca overdub. There is a timpani overdub at some point. There is a tambourine, and all of these elements feel kind of effortlessly glued into the drum set, right? They don't feel separate. When the timpani comes in, it almost sounds like a delay on the kit or something. It's very ambiguous what it is, and a huge amount of that is all of these things going through that compressor, getting glued together in a way that makes it all feel like one thing. That was Drums Through the Decades, the 1960s. That was obviously just 4 drum sounds from the 60s, so let us know which ones we missed.
We hope you enjoyed it, so please stay tuned for the next episode where we explore the drum sounds of the 1970s. And as always, we will see you next time.